On the night of October 29, 1924, a passenger train was moving through the Monashee Mountains of British Columbia on the Kettle Valley Line. Most of the passengers aboard were sleeping, and among them was a man who once led one of the most unusual communities in Canadian history. His name was Peter Verigin, and he was the spiritual and political leader of an entire community of Russian pacifists who had fled Tsarist persecution and settled in the mountains of southeastern British Columbia. He was 65 years old, and to his followers, he was known simply as Lordly. Shortly after 1 a.m., as the train passed between Castlegar and Grand Forks near a remote station called Farron High in the mountains, a powerful explosion ripped through CPR coach 1586. The blast was centered directly beneath Verigin's seat. The force of it tore the wooden coach apart. Debris was scattered across the tracks and down the mountainside. Engineer William Harkness of Engine 582 would later testify that he heard a very heavy explosion, followed by a number of small explosions that sounded like dynamite caps or small cartridges. He rushed back along the train to find the coach engulfed in flames. 8 people were killed, including Verigin, his young companion Mary Streleff, a local member of the Legislative Assembly named John McKee, and 5 others. 11 more were injured. Investigators would later recover the remains of an Italian clock wired to a battery about 75 meters from the wreckage. No one was ever charged. And over a century later, the assassination of Peter Verigin remains one of the most consequential unsolved murders in Canadian history. But as shocking as the bombing was, it wasn't an isolated event. It would become one of the longest-running domestic bombing campaigns in Canadian history. Over the next several decades, a radical faction of Verigin's own community would carry out repeated bombings and arsons targeting schools, railway bridges, power infrastructure, courthouses, and post offices. They burned their neighbors' homes and their own. And in response, the Canadian government would do something that most Canadians don't know ever happened. It would seize their children. This is the story of the Sons of Freedom, and outside of British Columbia, almost no one talks about it. To understand how any of this happened, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning is in Russia. The Doukhobors, which translates roughly to spirit wrestlers, were a Christian sect that emerged in southern Russia sometime in the 17th or early 18th century. They rejected just about every institution you can think of: the Russian Orthodox priesthood, the literal Bible, icons, and secular government. They believed God lived within every person and that the truth was carried through oral tradition, through hymns and psalms memorized and passed down from generation to generation. Most importantly, they refused military service. For these beliefs, they were persecuted relentlessly. Catherine II had them rounded up and relocated. Alexander I gathered them in the Crimean frontier in 1802, in an area known as the Milky Waters, where they briefly thrived. But then Nicholas I exiled them again, this time to the Caucasus Mountains, in 1841. And there they stayed for decades under the leadership of a woman named Lukaria Kalmykova, who held the community together until her death in 1886. After Lukaria died, a leadership crisis followed, and a man named Peter Vasilyevich Verigin emerged as the leader of what was called the Large Party. Russian authorities promptly arrested him, and he spent the next 16 years in exile in Siberia. But even from Siberia, Verigin continued to lead. In November of 1894, he smuggled out a message ordering his followers to refuse military service and to destroy their weapons. And they listened. On the night of June 28th to 29th, 1895, in 3 separate villages across the Caucasus, Doukhobors gathered their firearms, swords, and bayonets and piled them into enormous bonfires. They called it the burning of the arms. It was a spectacular act of mass pacifist defiance, and it was met with an equally spectacular response. Cossack soldiers descended on the Doukhobor villages. They beat and assaulted the residents. They billeted themselves in Doukhobor homes by force. And they made it clear that this kind of resistance would not be tolerated. Word of the repression eventually reached the outside world, largely because of one man. Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace, was deeply moved by the Doukhobor cause. He saw in them a living example of the kind of radical Christian pacifism he had been writing about for years. He lobbied the Russian government on their behalf, wrote letters to European newspapers, and pressured anyone with influence to help. Eventually, the Tsar's government agreed to let the Doukhobors leave, but on harsh conditions. They had to go at their own expense, carry foreign passports, and never return. Tolstoy donated the royalties from his novel Resurrection and his story Father Sergei to fund the emigration. The money amounted to about 34,200 rubles. His son Sergei personally accompanied 2,300 emigrants on the steamship Lake Huron from the Black Sea port of Batumi to Halifax in late 1898. 3 more ships followed. Quaker organizations in Britain and America covered the rest of the costs. And by June of 1899, approximately 7,500 Doukhobors had arrived in Canada. It was one of the largest organized religious migrations into Canada at the time, and it happened largely because a Russian novelist decided that their cause was worth the proceeds of his last great book. They settled on free homestead land in what is now Saskatchewan, under an agreement with Interior Minister Clifford Sifton that granted them an exemption from military service. They built over 90 communal villages with names like Voskresenie, which means resurrection, and Christianovka, meaning Christian village. They farmed together, lived together, and built entire communities around communal ownership and worship. And for a few short years, things seemed to be working. But then the Canadian government changed the deal. In 1905, a new interior minister named Frank Oliver replaced Sifton and began demanding that the Doukhobors swear oaths of allegiance and register their land individually under the Dominion Lands Act. These were exactly the kinds of state demands the Doukhobors had fled Russia to avoid, and the community fractured almost immediately into 3 distinct groups. One of those groups would eventually bomb schools, dynamite power infrastructure, and trigger one of the most controversial child seizure programs in Canadian history. The first group, known as the Independents, agreed to the government's terms. They substituted the word affirm for swear, registered their homesteads, and integrated into Canadian life. This was about 10% of the community. The second group, the community Doukhobors, refused. Under Peter Verigin, who had finally arrived in Canada in 1902, after completing his exile in Siberia, about 5,000 to 6,000 of them abandoned Saskatchewan entirely. They lost approximately 263,000 hectares of land in the process, and they migrated west to British Columbia. Verigin purchased over 6,000 hectares in the Kootenay and Boundary regions, and his followers built a new communal society from scratch. Orchards, sawmills, communal kitchens, and the famous brilliant jam factory all went up within a few years. And then there was the third group, the smallest and the most volatile. They called themselves the Svobodniki, or the Sons of Freedom. And they had emerged as early as 1902, when a group of about 50 naked Doukhobors near Yorkton, Saskatchewan, marched from village to village in protest of what they saw as the community's growing materialism. They burned a piece of communal farm equipment. Even Verigin himself had them charged. From the beginning, the Sons of Freedom saw themselves as the true conscience of the Doukhobor movement. To them, the movement had drifted. The community now owned businesses, property, and factories, exactly the kind of attachment they believed corrupted spiritual life. The Sons of Freedom believed that the only path to spiritual purity was total rejection of worldly attachments, and if the rest of the community would not listen to words, they would listen to fire. So that brings us back to the night of October 29, 1924, and the train bombing at Ferrin. After Verigin's assassination, investigators developed multiple theories about who might have planted the bomb. The Sons of Freedom had motive because they considered Verigin a sellout. Managers within the community Doukhobors business empire had motive because they were beginning to chafe under his control. His own son, Peter Petrovich Verigin, openly called his father a crook and bandit, liar and cheat, and an old reprobate who has no mind for anything but young girls. Soviet agents had motive because Verigin had refused Moscow's invitation to lead his followers back to Russia. And the Ku Klux Klan and the American Legion in Oregon had motive because Verigin had recently purchased about 875 acres near Peoria, Oregon, and they feared a Doukhobor migration to the United States. In 1956, a CPR deputy chief of police named James Johnston told a Winnipeg service club that he was almost sure a Russian watchmaker named Metro Grishin had built the bomb. But no one ever produced Grishin or the evidence. The CPR investigative files have effectively vanished. Every possible explanation for the murder of Peter Verigin remains, as one historian put it, nothing more than theory. After Verigin's death, his son Peter Petrovich Verigin, also known as Chistiakov or the Purger, arrived from Soviet Russia in 1927 to take over leadership of the community. At his first mass meeting at Brilliant, he was greeted by a knot of nude Sons of Freedom protesters standing prominently in the crowd, holding a banner that read, "Sons of Freedom cannot be slaves of corruption." He tried to handle them diplomatically, even calling them the ringing of a bell awakening us. But by that point, the movement was already spiraling beyond anyone's control. The first documented use of explosives by the Sons of Freedom was in 1923. Through the 20s and 30s, the campaign was mostly small-scale arson, aimed at fellow Doukhobors' barns, machinery, and homes. But it grew. And then came the Nude marches. In 1929, the Sons of Freedom began staging large-scale protests in which men, women, and sometimes children stripped naked on public roads. This wasn't nudism, it was theology. To the Svobodniki, nudity symbolized their complete rejection of materialism, their equality before God, and their refusal to recognize the authority of any secular government. They were presenting themselves as they came into the world, stripped of everything the state had tried to impose on them. The government did not see it that way. In 1932, the Canadian Parliament added a section to the Criminal Code making public nudity, in protest, punishable by 3 years imprisonment. That summer, BC Provincial Police arrested over 600 Sons of Freedom on the highway between Nelson and Castlegar. It was one of the largest coordinated mass arrests in Western Canadian history. The adults were transported to a specially built facility on Piers Island, a small island in the Strait of Georgia between Vancouver Island and the mainland. They remained there from 1932 to 1935, living in prison barracks far removed from their families and their land. And their children, more than 350 of them, were scattered across foster homes, orphanages, and industrial schools in Vancouver and Victoria. It was the first time the British Columbia government took Doukhobor children from their parents. It would not be the last. Through the 1940s, the violence only escalated. In 1943, a Son of Freedom named Peter Swetlishkov helped dynamite the Brilliant Jam Factory, which was the economic heart of the Doukhobor community. The damage was estimated at $150,000. Swetlishkov later confessed before a royal commission, telling the judge that he believed this was necessary to wake up our brothers from materialism, which he said was the main source of patriotism. Another Freedomite wrote that schools forced upon the Doukhobors by the government were destroyed by fire because schools are propagators of a false conception of civilization patronizing the beast, militarism. During this same period, a Ukrainian-born Baptist missionary named Stefan Sorokin managed to win leadership of the broader Sons of Freedom movement. By the early 1950s, Sorokin had positioned himself as a kind of spiritual figurehead for the group. But his tenure ended abruptly when he fled to Montevideo, Uruguay, taking with him close to $100,000 that had been collected from his followers. He would return to Canada in 1969 and continue leading a splinter group called the Reformed Doukhobors from Krestova until his death in 1984. But the damage his departure did to whatever organizational coherence the Sons of Freedom had was considerable. After 4 months of testimony, the judge, Harry Sullivan, declared the proceedings useless until the crazy people were put in the mental asylum and the criminals locked up in the penitentiary. On New Year's Eve of 1947, Sons of Freedom arsonists destroyed the Burns block in Grand Forks, causing $14,000 in damage. And the fires kept burning. By the early 1950s, people across the Kootenays had started expecting explosions. Schools were being firebombed, railway bridges were being dynamited, power infrastructure was being targeted, and the BC government, under newly elected Premier W.A.C. Bennett and his Social Credit Party, decided that a harder approach was needed. Their solution was to take the children. The legal basis was the BC School Act and the Protection of Children Act, which together allowed the government to apprehend any child under 18 who was not enrolled in school. At dawn on September 9, 1953, RCMP officers from across the Kootenays converged on a nude protest near a school at Perry Siding. 148 adults were arrested, and 104 children, some as young as 4 years old, were loaded onto buses and driven 99 kilometers to a facility in the small town of New Denver. The building they were taken to was a former tuberculosis sanatorium on the shore of Slocan Lake. It had previously been used to house Japanese Canadians during the internment of World War II. Now it would become a residential-style institution for Doukhobor children. They called the program many things, but the children would come to know it by what it felt like: a prison. The children were placed behind a chain-link fence that, horrifyingly, they themselves were forced to help build. Their parents were allowed to visit twice a month for 1 hour at a time from the other side of that fence. Girls had their long braids cut off. The mattresses they slept on were pulled from the attic, left over from the tuberculosis patients. As one survivor later told the BC ombudsperson, "That attic was rat and mice infested. The mattresses were stained and stinky, and we had to put those mattresses on our beds." Small young children sleeping in mattresses that were soiled and dirty and mouse infested. A second major sweep came on January 18, 1955, when 70 RCMP officers raided the village of Krestova and removed another 40 children. In total, approximately 200 children passed through the New Denver Dormitory between 1953 and the program's official end on August 2, 1959. Some were held continuously for up to 6 years. The testimonies from survivors paint a picture that is disturbingly familiar to anyone aware of Canada's Indigenous residential school system. Bill Barasoff was 8 years old when the RCMP came for him. He later recalled, "There was no knock, nothing. Dad got up, they picked him up, and one man held him against the wall. His feet were not touching the ground. He held him against the wall for maybe 15 minutes, until Mother dressed me." Another survivor, a woman identified as Mandy, was 6 years old when she was ripped from her mother's arms. A fragment of her mother's skirt remained clenched in her teeth as she was carried away. She was held at New Denver for more than 6 years and never recovered. She eventually neglected her own children and died young. Walter Svetlashoff spent 4 years hiding from the RCMP before being caught at age 11. He spent 4 months in New Denver. Decades later, at the age of 77, he said, "To me, it was a prison. The only pain that I have is that I'm fearful of everything." And then there were the allegations of sexual abuse. An elderly man interviewed by the BC ombudsperson described a matron who used to corner little Doukhobor boys in closets and sexually molest them until they cried or screamed. One of the children taken to New Denver was a 7-year-old girl named Elizabeth Hlukoff, who was seized from her home in Grand Forks in 1954. She spent 4.5 years inside the facility. Decades later, she would write a memoir called Drawer 49, Letters from a Stolen Youth, the title referring to the numbered box where she received letters from her family. Another boy, Fred McCourtoff, was 9 when he was seized. He would later become the BC coordinator of the Council of Doukhobors in Canada, and he would spend years calling for accountability. He described the seizure as an attempt to assimilate the children and strip them of their identity. Survivors also spoke of a teacher who, instead of teaching, simply read Hardy Boys novels aloud to the class. Punishment routinely took the form of lost visits with parents. And when the children were finally released, many were so damaged that the effects would cascade through generations. One survivor knew a mother who committed suicide after her children were taken. Another recalled a grandfather who died of a heart attack while watching his grandchildren bust away. Multiple New Denver alumni later died of suicide or addiction in the years that followed. While all of this was happening, the Sons of Freedom campaign was reaching its most violent phase. And here's one of the most important things to understand about this story. The mainstream Doukhobor community, the thousands of people living peaceful lives in the Kootenays, farming their orchards and running their cooperatives, they were not the ones doing the bombing. They were the primary victims of it. The brilliant jam factory that was bombed in 1943, that belonged to the community Doukhobors. The homes that were set ablaze year after year, those belonged to community Doukhobors. John J. Verigin, who would later become the chairman of the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ, had his own home burned by Freedomites in the mid-1940s. Between 1953 and 1959 alone, the same years their children were locked inside New Denver, the Sons of Freedom burned 74 Doukhobor homes across the communities of Appledale, Perry Siding, Shore Acres, Winlaw, Glade, Goose Creek, and Gilpin. The community Doukhobors explicitly condemned the violence as a betrayal of their central principle of non-violence. But it didn't matter to the Canadian public and the government. A Doukhobor was a Doukhobor. The actions of a radical minority defined the perception of the entire community. Meanwhile, the RCMP had set up a special D squad, with the D standing for Doukhobor, to deal with the Sons of Freedom threat. One of the key members was Staff Sergeant Fred Bodnaruk, a Ukrainian-Canadian officer who had been recruited to the force's Russian Communist section. In 1957, he was transferred to the Nelson subdivision with what the RCMP Veterans Association later described as the special assignment of dealing with terrorism being committed by the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors. His Russian language skills allowed him to penetrate the community in ways other officers could not. The most important Freedomite informant in the published record was a man named Mike Bayoff. He was implicated in shooting a guard at Verigin's tomb in the hand before turning Crown witness and helping solve many of the bombings. But the informant work was dangerous, and the Freedomites had demonstrated over and over again that they were willing to use lethal force. The climax came in 1961 and 1962. On December 10th and 11th of 1961, a Canadian Pacific Railway rail bridge near Nelson was dynamited. On February 4th, 1962, 4 half-gallon can bombs were found burning inside the Nelson courthouse. 2 cab drivers, David Wigg, known as Buster, and Bill Morris happened to be nearby. They kicked in the burning glass door and pulled the bombs out of the foyer minutes before they fully detonated. Wig later said that it just made him mad. And when he thought of that beautiful building being gutted, he didn't think of anything else except saving it. Then on the night of March 6, 1962, the Sons of Freedom pulled off their most audacious attack. They bombed a 300-foot West Kootenai Power Company transmission tower on Kootenai Lake. The tower collapsed, instantly cutting 170,000 volts of power to the Cominco-Sullivan mine and its fertilizer and iron plants at Kimberley. Over 1,000 workers were idled overnight. The RCMP responded with a massive sweep. The entire Sons of Freedom Fraternal Council was arrested. 36 leaders were convicted of arson or conspiracy and sentenced to 12 years at the specially built, fireproof mountain prison at Agassiz. The prison had been constructed specifically for Freedomite inmates, with cement furniture and fireproofed bedding, because authorities were genuinely concerned they would try to burn the prison down from the inside. The bombers sometimes became their own victims. From the night of August 13th to 14th, 1958, a man named Philip Pereverasov of Winlaw was killed when a bomb he was assembling exploded prematurely on a road near Kelowna. His body was thrown about 20 feet. Hours later, in what appeared to be a coordinated attack, bombs detonated at post offices in Oliver, Osoyoos, and at a professional building in Vernon. When you add it all up, the Sons of Freedom carried out 1,112 separate acts of arson and bombing over the course of nearly 60 years. The total property damage exceeded $20 million. And these are not abstract numbers. These were real explosions in real communities where real people lived and worked and sent their children to school. After the 1962 mass arrests, one last extraordinary event played out. Beginning on September 1st of that year, a woman named Florence Storjoff, known as Big Fanny, led about 1,000 Sons of Freedom followers on a 480-kilometer protest march from the village of Krestova to the mountain prison at Agassiz. They walked through Princeton and Hope, into Vancouver where they spent the winter, and then continued on to Agassiz, where they set up a tent shanty town in a gravel pit beside the prison. The trek was grueling and dramatic enough that it helped inspire the founding of the BC Civil Liberties Association. Storjoff herself died of cancer at the age of 56, roughly a year after the march ended. And the shantytown beside Agassiz remained in place until the last imprisoned Freedomite was released in 1972. After that, the Sons of Freedom campaign slowly disintegrated. There were smaller incidents through the 1970s, including the suspected arson of the USCC Community Center in Grand Forks in 1975. But the sustained bombing and burning that had defined the Kootenays for decades was effectively over. What remained was the silence. For most Canadians, none of this ever happened. The story never entered the national consciousness the way other chapters of Canadian history did. And there are a few reasons for that. The first is geographic isolation. The Kootenays are more than 600 kilometers from Vancouver. The campaign almost never touched a major urban center, so it remained a regional crisis that was easy for the rest of the country to ignore. The second is the Doukhobor community's own oral tradition and historic reluctance to cooperate with outside authorities, including journalists. The inside story was difficult to extract. And the one popular book that did attempt it, Sima Holt's 1964 book Terror in the Name of God, is regarded by many Doukhobor scholars as polemical and pro-state. And the third reason is perhaps the most uncomfortable. The story does not fit Canada's preferred narrative about itself. A Tolstoy-funded pacifist community, fleeing religious persecution, welcomed to Canada, and then either radicalized by Anglo-Canadian assimilation policies, or revealing itself as a violent cult, or somehow both at the same time. It's a story that resists simple conclusions. It took decades for the province to acknowledge what happened at New Denver. A 1999 report by the British Columbia Ombudsperson concluded that the treatment of the children had been described as unjust, oppressive, and otherwise wrong. A statement of regret followed in 2004, but it stopped short of a full apology. Survivors kept pushing, arguing that regret without accountability was not enough. Lawsuits filed in 2012 collapsed when their lawyer resigned during the final hearing. Finally, in February of 2024, Attorney General Nikki Sharma delivered a formal apology in Castlegar. Premier David Eby followed in the legislature, alongside a $10 million compensation package. Lorraine Salican-Walton, the daughter of 2 New Denver survivors, told the CBC, "It breaks my heart that they are not here. 71 years of suffering, which created intergenerational trauma for us, for our children." The Government of Canada has not apologized. It is worth pausing here to address the comparison that survivors themselves have drawn between New Denver and the Indian residential school system. The scale is not equivalent. New Denver targeted a single, tiny religious subcommunity of about 200 children over 6 years for a specific reason tied to school non-attendance and parental incarceration. The Indian residential school system targeted Indigenous nations as a matter of explicit national policy from the 1880s to 1996, took an estimated 150,000 children and left thousands dead. Conflating the two would be misleading, but the underlying logic was the same. In both cases, the Canadian government decided that a community's children would be better off raised by the state than by their own parents. In both cases, the children were taken by force. In both cases, the institutions were abusive. And in both cases, the trauma cascaded through generations. Survivors of both systems have explicitly drawn this parallel themselves, including before the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal in 2012. Today, Doukhobor communities still exist in British Columbia, centered around the brilliant cultural center near Castlegar, but the numbers have dwindled dramatically. In the 1941 census, Doukhobor identification in Canada was at its peak. By the 2021 census, only 1,675 Canadians self-identified as Doukhobors, a 90% drop. An estimated 30,000 Canadians are of Doukhobor descent, but most no longer identify with the community. What happened in the Kootenays is a story about what radicalism can do to a community, but it is also a story about what a government can do in response. The bombings were real. So was the abuse that followed. And the fact that almost no one in Canada knows about either of them is maybe the most disturbing part of all. At the New Denver site today, there is a permanent memorial completed in 2004. It includes a preserved section of the original chain-link fence and interpretive panels telling the story of the children who were held there. The building itself still stands on the shore of Slocan Lake, and if you visit, which most Canadians never will, you can stand where those children stood and look out through the fence at the mountains of the Slocan Valley, unchanged from when those children were looking out at them. The memorial exists because survivors fought for decades to make sure the story would not disappear entirely. Some of them did not live long enough to see the apology. Many of the 200 children who passed through those doors are now gone, and the ones who remain are in their 70s and 80s, carrying the weight of something that their own country spent 70 years pretending never happened. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching.